On December 17, 1944, at a checkpoint outside WWII, Belgium, Sergeant William Creel's jeep came to a halt as a military policeman signaled them to stop. The morning air was cold, and 3 men inside the jeep, dressed in authentic-looking American uniforms, carrying regulation weapons, and speaking almost perfect English, seemed like normal American soldiers. But Creel had been warned about a bizarre possibility. German soldiers could be operating behind American lines, disguised as U.S. troops, speaking English, and even carrying U.S. gear. Creel asked for the password. The men hesitated, then faltered in their English. That's when Creel noticed the Sten guns, British weapons that no American patrol would carry. Within minutes, the men were captured. Beneath their olive-drab uniforms they wore German field gray. Their names were Eunicia Manfred Paris, Oberfenrig Gunther Billing, and Guido Wilhelm Schmidt, 3 of the most infamous prisoners of the Battle of the Bulge. What they didn't know was that their capture would set off a wave of paranoia within the U.S. military, triggering a widespread campaign of cultural testing at every checkpoint, turning each conversation into a test of American identity. Baseball stats, state capitals, and Hollywood trivia became tools for detecting spies. The origins of this deception started on October 27, 1944, at Hitler's headquarters in Rastenburg, East Prussia. Hitler summoned SS Commando Otto Skorzeny and gave him an audacious mission: launch a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes, heading for the strategic port of Antwerp. The plan was to split the American and British forces, recreating the success of 1940, when German tanks reached the English Channel in days. But this time, the speed of the operation was critical, and they needed to capture a bridge over the Meuse River intact before Allied engineers could destroy it. Skorzeny's team, Panzer Brigade 150, was tasked with seizing those bridges before they could be blown. Hitler suggested an unconventional tactic: his men would wear American and British uniforms. This would sow confusion, disrupt communication, misdirect troops, and spread panic. Skorzeny immediately understood the implications under international law. According to the 1907 Hague Convention, soldiers caught wearing enemy uniforms were considered spies and could be executed. This led to intense discussions with German generals and military leaders. Hitler assured Skorzeny that as long as the men removed the uniforms before engaging in combat, it would be permissible. Within days, Skorzeny submitted his plans, requesting 300 men with knowledge of English and American dialects. On October 25th, the Oberkommando des Heers sent out orders to German units on the Western Front, calling for English-speaking volunteers for secret commando operations. This order, signed by Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, was intercepted by Allied intelligence on November 30th, but it was dismissed as a decoy. No one believed the Germans would be so bold. Despite this, volunteers started arriving from all branches of the German military. Many had no idea what they had signed up for. Fritz Priest, a 21-year-old Luftwaffe private trained as an English translator, thought he would be interrogating prisoners far from the front lines. Instead, he was sent to a training camp at Grafenwöhr in eastern Bavaria, where security was extreme. One man was shot when his letter home gave too many details about the mission. The recruits soon discovered the truth. Of the 500 men who eventually formed Panzer Brigade 150, only 10 spoke perfect English with a good understanding of American slang. Another 30 or 40 spoke English decently, but didn't know much about American idioms. The rest could barely speak English beyond basic phrases. Skorzeny later admitted the situation was dire. Those with minimal English were trained to shout, "Sorry," and then fake a diarrhea emergency when approached by Americans. The equipment situation was equally chaotic. Skorzeny had requested 15 Sherman tanks, 20 armored cars, 100 jeeps, and plenty of American and British uniforms. What he got instead were 2 broken-down Sherman tanks, a few Panther tanks, armored cars, and German assault guns. The Panthers were camouflaged to resemble Shermans, but they were hardly convincing, and only very inexperienced American soldiers might be fooled. The uniforms were also a mess. Some were British, Polish, or Russian. Others were summer uniforms, despite the cold December conditions. Skorzeny got enough authentic American uniforms and weapons for only the most elite commando teams. These teams, called Einheil, received intensive training in American military customs, learning how to speak, walk, and even chew gum like Americans. They studied American military ranks, badges, and procedures, and watched American movies to perfect their accents. The mission was divided into 3 categories: creating confusion behind enemy lines, capturing critical bridges, and disrupting Allied communications. The ultimate goal was to cause chaos and slow down the Allied advance, allowing the Germans to carry out their counteroffensive with greater ease. However, the operation's poor planning, lack of resources, and the recruits' limited knowledge of American culture made the whole thing a desperate gamble. The deception might have been a revolutionary idea, but the reality of executing it was a logistical nightmare. On December 17, 1944, a checkpoint outside WWII, Belgium, stopped a jeep carrying 3 soldiers dressed in American uniforms. The military policeman on duty, Sergeant William Creel, had been warned about the possibility of German soldiers disguising themselves as Americans behind enemy lines. When he asked for the password, the soldiers hesitated, their English faltering. That's when Creel noticed the Sten guns, British weapons that no American unit would carry. The 3 men were captured, and under their American uniforms, they wore German field gray. These men, Manfred Paris, Gunther Billing, and Guido Schmidt, became infamous prisoners of war during the Battle of the Bulge. Their capture triggered a wave of paranoia within the U.S. military, sparking a widespread campaign to test soldiers' American knowledge. At every checkpoint, soldiers were questioned with bizarre trivia. Everything from baseball statistics to Hollywood gossip. No one could be trusted. The origins of this operation began back in October 1944, when Adolf Hitler summoned SS Commando Otto Skorzeny to his headquarters in East Prussia. Skorzeny had already earned a reputation as one of the most daring commandos, having led the rescue of Mussolini in 1943 and the kidnapping of Miklos Horthy Jr. in 1944. Now, Hitler tasked him with a bold mission to break through the Ardennes and seize crucial bridges over the Meuse River, preventing the Allies from blowing them up. Skorzeny's job was to lead a special unit that would wear American and British uniforms to confuse the enemy and create chaos. Skorzeny knew this plan was risky. Under the Hague Convention, soldiers captured in enemy uniforms were considered spies and could be executed. Still, he proceeded. Skorzeny requested 300 men who spoke English, knowing that the plan would need soldiers familiar with American dialects and culture. The order went out across the Western Front, asking for volunteers who spoke English and understood American slang. But Allied intelligence intercepted the request, dismissing it as a bluff. Despite this, volunteers arrived from various branches of the German military, many unaware of the true nature of the mission. Among them was Fritz Priest, a young Luftwaffe private trained as an English translator. He thought he would be far behind the front lines interrogating prisoners, but instead, he found himself in a highly secure training camp in Bavaria, where the real mission was revealed. Only a small fraction of the 500 men who were eventually assembled spoke fluent English. Many barely knew the language, and the few that understood American slang were selected for the most dangerous missions. The disguised troops were divided into different units, each with a specific role: demolition squads to destroy bridges and supply dumps, reconnaissance patrols to mislead American forces, and commandos working with German infantry to cut communication lines. But there were risks. If captured while wearing American uniforms, they were as good as dead. And in the confusion of battle, they could easily be mistaken for real Americans by German forces and shot by their own side. On December 16, 1944, Panzer Brigade 150 moved out, following behind 3 attacking panzer divisions. Their objective was to seize the Meuse bridges quickly, but the success of the mission depended on the rapid advance of the SS Panzer Division under the command of Joachim Peiper. If they broke through, the disguised troops could slip through the chaos and reach the bridges before the Allies could destroy them. The Germans launched their assault in the early morning hours, catching American forces off guard. American troops, spread thin across a wide front, faced an overwhelming German force. The Germans quickly made progress, and the disguised units infiltrated American-held areas, misdirecting convoys, cutting wires, and spreading confusion. One team even redirected an American armored convoy to the wrong road. But by December 17th, things started to fall apart. The SS Panzer Division failed to meet its objectives on schedule, and fierce American resistance at places like Elsenborn Ridge slowed the German advance. The breakthrough the Germans needed never came, and Skorzeny quickly realized the operation's original goals were out of reach. He suggested using his unit as a conventional force instead, which was approved, but the commandos had already been scattered behind enemy lines. Some succeeded in their missions, but others were caught when their English faltered, or when American soldiers noticed their British weapons or German boots. The capture of Puris, Billing, and Schmidt near Awela on December 17 set off a panic. Schmidt, during interrogation, claimed that their mission was part of a larger plan to infiltrate the Allied Supreme Headquarters and assassinate General Dwight Eisenhower. Whether this was true or just disinformation remains unclear, but it caused an immediate and significant reaction. Security around Eisenhower was dramatically increased, with guards checking everyone who entered his headquarters in Versailles. Eisenhower, reportedly furious, spent Christmas in virtual isolation, guarded against potential threats. The fear spread far beyond protecting Eisenhower. American forces, already on edge from the German offensive, now believed that infiltrators could be anywhere. Checkpoints were set up across the rear areas, and American MPs began interrogating every soldier they encountered, asking them questions designed to expose any spies. These questions ranged from American geography to sports trivia, to questions about pop culture, and even about personal details like who Frank Sinatra was married to. The system was chaotic and often absurd. Some genuine American soldiers were detained because they couldn't answer questions about sports teams or state capitals. General Omar Bradley himself was briefly detained after correctly identifying Springfield as the capital of Illinois, because the MP believed it was Chicago. British soldiers faced similar challenges. Reconnaissance officer David Nann, when asked who won the 1940 World Series, could only reply that he had no idea. British troops who couldn't answer these American questions were often detained until their identities were verified. The system that developed was flawed and inefficient, and the paranoia it created slowed down military operations. It became a strange and uncomfortable part of the war effort, where every soldier became a potential spy, and every checkpoint was an opportunity for chaos. The deception operation may have failed, but it left behind a lasting legacy of suspicion, confusion, and the brutal reality of war. Some American soldiers deliberately gave wrong answers to the absurd questions at checkpoints, protesting the interrogations. As a result, they ended up detained themselves. Others became frustrated at being questioned by junior enlisted men, leading to confrontations that only slowed down the entire process. This paranoia significantly impacted military operations. Movements that should have taken hours were delayed for days as every vehicle was stopped and each occupant questioned. Supply convoys came to a halt while drivers tried to prove their American identity. Reinforcements rushing to threatened sectors were also delayed by repeated interrogations. Even commanders found their orders questioned by subordinates, who began to suspect everyone around them could be a German infiltrator. The paranoia had an even more severe impact on the German infiltrators themselves. Those still behind American lines struggled to move freely. They had prepared by studying American military procedures, learning rank insignia, and memorizing army organization. However, they hadn't anticipated the interrogations about baseball stats, Hollywood gossip, or regional slang. Some infiltrators tried to avoid checkpoints entirely, traveling cross-country or through forests, which made them more noticeable to American patrols. Others tried to bluff their way through, offering excuses for why they couldn't answer certain questions. Most of them didn't succeed. Between December 16th and 31st, American forces captured 23 members of Operation Grief. 16 were caught in December 1944, with the team leader, Goss Schultz, captured later and tried in May 1945. The legal situation was clear under international law. According to Article 23 of the Hague Convention on Land Warfare, soldiers wearing enemy uniforms during military operations could be tried as spies, not as prisoners of war. The first trial began on December 21, 1944 at Henry Chapel. Puris, Billing, and Schmidt were charged with violating the laws of war by wearing American uniforms during military operations. The evidence was undeniable. They had been captured in American uniforms with American weapons, carrying American identification, but wearing German field gray underneath. The trial was quick, and all three were convicted and sentenced to death by firing squad. On December 23rd, just 2 days before Christmas, the sentences were carried out. The three Germans were led to the execution site by American military police. Captain J. Iser of the 633rd Medical Clearing Station placed white paper targets over their hearts, removed Schmidt's glasses, and blindfolded the prisoners. The firing squad opened fire, and all three men died instantly. Their bodies were cut down, buried, and eventually interred at the German military cemetery in Lommel, Belgium, where they rest today alongside 39,000 other German war dead. Between December 21st and 31st, 13 more Operation Grief participants were tried and executed, either at Henry, Chapelle, or at High. Wilhelm Wessenfeld, Manfred Brani, Hans Reich, Arno Krauer, Gunter Schultz, Hahart Miegel, Horst Jerich, Norbert Pollack, Ralph Benjamin Meir, Hans Witzuk, Otto O, Alfred Franz, and Anton Moruk were all sentenced to death by firing squad after military trials. Each trial found the defendants guilty of violating the Hague Convention, and each sentence was reviewed and approved by senior commanders. The executions were carried out with military precision, without malice but without mercy. Josh Schultz, the team leader, was captured later and tried in May 1945. His execution, however, didn't happen until June 14th, after Germany's surrender. The reason for the delay is unclear, as is who ordered his execution. The United States Ninth Army carried out the sentence. In total, 17 Operation Grief participants were executed for wearing enemy uniforms. Despite the high cost, the operation's tactical achievements were minimal. No bridges were captured, no major demolitions succeeded, and no critical communications were permanently disrupted. A few road signs were reversed, some telephone lines cut, and a few American units received false orders, though most were quickly corrected. But the psychological impact far outweighed the operation's tactical results. For weeks, American forces operated under the assumption that German infiltrators could be anywhere. This paranoia affected decision-making at every level. Eisenhower, confined to his headquarters, was cut off from direct battlefield observation during the critical first days of the offensive. The checkpoint delays slowed American responses to the German offensive, and units that should have reached key sectors in hours took days to arrive. The widespread suspicion degraded unit cohesion, with American soldiers becoming more focused on the threat of infiltrators among them than on the enemy ahead. Meanwhile, the Battle of the Bulge raged on. German forces pushed deep into American lines, creating the Bulge that gave the battle its name. At Bastogne, American defenders, surrounded by German forces, held out against a German surrender ultimatum. Acting Commander Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe famously responded with a single word, "Nuts." When German officers asked what it meant, they were told it was the same as "go to hell." The 101st Airborne held Bastogne until they were relieved by General George Patton's Third Army on December 26th. Patton's forces had executed a remarkable 90-degree turn to break the siege. By early January, Allied counterattacks had eliminated the Bulge and restored the front lines. The battle lasted from December 16, 1944, to January 25, 1945. More than 1 million men participated, making it the largest battle fought by the U.S. Army outside the Civil War. American casualties exceeded 80,000, including 19,000 killed and 23,000 captured. German casualties were similar, but Germany couldn't replace these losses. The Battle of the Bulge marked the end of Germany's ability to conduct offensive operations in the West. Hitler had gambled everything on this offensive and lost. For Otto Skorzeny, Operation Grief ended on December 17th, when Panzer Brigade 150 switched to conventional operations. On December 21st, they attempted to capture Malmedy but were repulsed after several assaults. Skorzeny was wounded by artillery shrapnel near Lenneville, but he recovered and continued to serve until Germany's surrender. In May 1945, he surrendered to the 30th Infantry Regiment and spent 2 years in custody awaiting trial. In 1947, at the Nuremberg trials, Skorzeny and 9 officers from Panzer Brigade 150 faced charges for using American uniforms in combat. Their defense centered around a key distinction. Their men were ordered to remove the uniforms before engaging in combat. The tribunal ultimately acquitted Skorzeny and his men, citing a legal loophole and the fact that the operation had been designed for infiltration, not direct combat. This controversial decision set a precedent for the laws of war, ruling that using enemy uniforms for deception was a legitimate tactic as long as the disguises were removed before combat. Despite this legal victory, the legacy of Operation Grief and its failure lingered. 17 of Scorsini's men had been executed for the same actions that he was acquitted of, and the operation's psychological impact on the Allies lasted far longer than its tactical effects. The distinction made in the trial of Otto Skorsiny and his men would shape how international law was interpreted for decades. Skorsiny didn't stay in custody for long. In 1948, he managed to escape from an internment camp in Darmstadt, with the help of former SS officers disguised as American military police. Some historians speculate that American intelligence may have tacitly allowed or even assisted his escape, though there's no evidence to support this. After escaping, Skorsiny hid out on a Bavarian farm before moving to Salzburg and Paris, eventually settling in Spain. He worked as a military advisor to Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser. Skorsiny died of cancer on July 5, 1975, in Madrid at age 67. He never expressed regret for his role in Operation Grief or any of his wartime actions. The checkpoint interrogations became part of American military folklore. The strange questions about baseball, Hollywood, state capitals, and movie stars became symbols of how cultural identity had become a tool for security during a time of crisis. The makeshift system, though chaotic, proved effective at exposing infiltrators. Their language training couldn't replicate the natural cultural knowledge that Americans absorbed from childhood. Being American wasn't just about speaking English or wearing the right uniform. It was about shared cultural experiences, common references, and collective memories that couldn't be quickly taught to outsiders. The 17 men executed for Operation Grief are remembered today mostly through military cemeteries and historical records. Their graves at Lommel are maintained with the same care as those of soldiers who died in conventional combat. The cemetery doesn't distinguish between those executed as spies and those killed in battle. All are simply German war dead. Manfred Paris was 23 when he was executed. Gunter Billing, 21, remained a convinced Nazi to the end. Wilhelm Schmidt, 24, faced death with quiet resignation. Each of these men was someone's son, perhaps someone's brother. Each made choices that led them to that frozen morning in Belgium, to those blindfolds, and those rifles. Operation Grief's legacy extended far beyond its tactical failure. The operation showed that special operations couldn't compensate for conventional military failure. A few infiltrators couldn't capture bridges if the German tanks didn't reach them. No amount of deception or confusion could replace the breakthrough that never came. Yet, the operation succeeded in creating disruption far beyond its tactical accomplishments. The mere possibility of infiltrators created panic that affected hundreds of thousands of soldiers. This gap between perception and reality became a key lesson in modern psychological warfare strategy. The Battle of the Bulge itself continued through January 1945. Allied forces resumed their advance toward Germany. Within 4 months, the Third Reich collapsed. Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker, and Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. The 17 men executed for Operation Grief were already dead. Their mission had failed in its tactical goals, but succeeded in creating confusion and fear that slowed Allied operations during the battle's critical early phase. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, speaking to Parliament on January 18, 1945, while the battle still raged, called it undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and predicted it would be regarded as one of the greatest American victories. Churchill noted that Americans had engaged 30 to 40 German soldiers for every British soldier, emphasizing that this was fundamentally an American battle and an American victory. The checkpoint guards who asked about baseball didn't know they were creating a piece of military folklore. They were solving an immediate problem, improvising a security measure to identify potential enemies. Their solution worked because it was rooted in genuine shared culture. Americans knew about baseball, Hollywood, state capitals, and more because they grew up with this knowledge, absorbing it naturally. Germans trying to impersonate Americans could study facts, but couldn't replicate the cultural fluency that came from living it. This distinction between learned facts and natural cultural knowledge proved decisive. The failure of Operation Grief demonstrated a principle that remains relevant today. Cultural fluency, which is absorbed over years of lived experience, cannot be quickly taught to adults from different backgrounds. Modern special operations forces now spend years preparing deep cover agents because language training, factual knowledge, and behavioral coaching are necessary but not enough. Genuine cultural fluency requires immersion and time. The fundamental challenge persists. Culture is absorbed through experience, not taught in classrooms. Operation Grief showed both the potential and limits of special operations. Small units conducting unconventional operations can cause disruption far beyond their numbers. The psychological impact can be much greater than the tactical results. But without conventional military success providing the necessary conditions, special operations cannot achieve strategic goals. Deception can't replace victory. For historians and military strategists, Operation Grief remains a compelling case study. It exemplifies how ambitious plans disconnected from realistic assessments of resources lead to failure. Hitler's late war decision-making followed this pattern. Grand ideas with insufficient resources, divorced from operational reality. Yet the operation's unintended success in creating panic proved that psychological warfare and deception can be powerful force multipliers. The 17 men who died before firing squads for wearing enemy uniforms would likely have been forgotten, if not for the historical record. They were not particularly important men. They accomplished little before their capture, and their operation failed comprehensively. But their executions marked a significant moment in military and legal history, clarifying the use of enemy uniforms in warfare. The legacy of Operation Grief lives in the lessons it taught about identity verification, cultural knowledge, and the limits of special operations. The graves at Lommel mark the lives cut short by war and its brutal logic. The checkpoint guards who asked about baseball were American soldiers carrying the psychological burden of executing prisoners, even those convicted of espionage. Operation Grief may have failed to capture a single bridge and caused little direct destruction, but the fear it created delayed reinforcements, disrupted decisions, and consumed resources during critical days. Its indirect impact shaped the opening phase of the battle. The infiltrators' capture, trial, and execution demonstrated American military justice in wartime, operating under extreme pressure. The speed from capture to execution reflected combat conditions, though modern standards would require more deliberate proceedings. The Battle of the Bulge continued for 5 more weeks after the infiltrators' execution, but it ended in a German defeat and the loss of their strategic reserve. The story of Operation Grief and the Battle of the Bulge reminds us that warfare is more than just battlefield tactics. Psychological impact, cultural factors, and perception can be just as important as tactical victories. A failed operation that creates panic can disrupt enemy operations more than a successful one that remains undetected. The checkpoint interrogations worked because they tested cultural knowledge that real Americans naturally had. But infiltrators could never replicate, no matter how much they studied. The soldiers at those checkpoints were not just questioning identity. They were helping shape the future of military strategy,